Welcome to SILS Connections. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Lori Haight, and our guest today is Jason Griffey, talking about the future of information professions and you. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to use the chat box and I'll make sure to share those. Jason, I'll let you introduce yourself and then we'll begin with our topic for today.
Sure thing. Hey, thanks for joining me, and thanks for the invite for being willing to bring me in this way. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because my intro has some slides. Because, well, why not? If I can, I might as well. So let's see. All right. Hopefully, you can see my opening slide at this point.
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. All right, so my plan today, as I had sort of outlined it with Lori, was to talk through sort of the high points and low points of what I see as the future of sort of information professions, libraries primarily, but a bit broader in the sense of kind of information writ large. And I'm going to do that in a couple of different ways. I'll talk about in just a second. First, let me get me. So I'm Jason Griffey. I am an alumni of SILS. I graduated with my Master's of Library Science from UNC in 2004. And so I am a bona fide librarian, although I am maybe somewhat better known in library circles as a technologist. My background prior to going to SILS was heavily influenced by technology. And so when I graduated from SILS, I was pretty sure what I wanted to do was be a reference and instruction librarian. I kind of took all of the course load to prepare me for my life moving forward as a reference and instruction librarian because I was kind of burned out on technology. Turns out it's a little like the mafia. Once you're in, you're in. And so when I took my first position as a reference instruction librarian, it took about a year and a half or maybe 2 years before the dean was like, oh, hey, you can do this stuff. Come over here and do this stuff. And so I ended up as a technologist. I've done a lot of other things in my career over the last, decade and a half or so. I had the incredible opportunity to be a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet Society at Harvard. I was also a fellow briefly at MetaLab at Harvard, doing research on a lot of things, but information access in the developing world, as well as sort of rural America and how information gets shared in places without good infrastructure. I am an author. I've written a few things, and this is a small sampling. If you look at my website, it's got a list of things, but most of my writing has been focused on sort of emerging technology. That's really the area where my research and writing and focus has been over the course of the last several years. And currently, I am working for a national nonprofit called the National Information Standards Organization, or NISO, who develop information standards relating to kind of publisher, publication, vendor, and library interactions on via technology. So everything from Z3950, which is an information standard about sharing information between systems, to things like some of the initial work that was done in the Microsoft Doc. The XML format for Microsoft Doc files was partially developed by NISO. So we do a lot of standards development and technology, and I am currently the Director of Strategic Initiatives, which is a fancy way of saying I look for new stuff for us to be doing. So that's what I'm doing now. My heart, however, is always in libraries. That's where my sort of focus and goals are always kind of revolving around the library world. So I wanted to do a couple of things here in the next 25 minutes or so. I wanted to talk about the technology that I find both fascinating and troubling, so that you have sort of my perspective on what it is. It's going to really change the world of information over the next, say, decade, as you enter into the various professions related to information. And then I wanted to talk about some of the challenges that revolve around sort of the modern moment, as well as the sort of clawing our way out of this modern moment, and some of the problems that hopefully we will all work together to solve. So I want to start with technology, and then we'll talk about a couple of other things very quickly at the end. It's going to be pretty quick, but we're going to have time for Q&A at the end. So technology fascinates me, and it fascinates me for a bunch of reasons, one of which is that it operates differently than sort of other things in our world do. Technology changes exponentially instead of linearly. Most of the things that we think about in our world change sort of linearly. We've learned a little bit more over the last 6 months about exponential growth as it relates to things like, diseases. But in general, we don't think about exponential growth in the human world very much, and technology is one of the things that that changes in that way. So one of the things that I normally say if I'm doing a presentation to a group of librarians is that one of the ways to think about this is that right now, where we're sitting and standing, is the slowest that technology will ever be. It is the most expensive that technology will ever be. It is the technology will only ever get better and cheaper over time. That's just the way sort of Moore's law and Kuhne's law and some of the other sort of engineering laws that drive technological growth work. And so technology only ever becomes more omnipresent. We're short of something like nuclear holocaust or zombie apocalypse. We're never going to sort of backslide on the technology growth. So it is just part of the world, and it's going to continue to be part of the world, and it's going to continue to rule a lot of the ways that the world interacts with information and shares information. And so it's core. It's one of the things that we cannot get away from and will not sort of slow down for us. So I wanted to talk about two areas of technology that I find again, fascinating, worrisome, problematic, opportunistic, maybe places where if you chose to spend some of your research and or development time in SILS, you might benefit from that. One of those is AI, artificial intelligence. I think that there's very little in our lives that isn't going to be touched by the growth of artificial intelligence over the course of the next decade. We're going to see it rise in power in a number of ways. Jeffrey Hinton, who is a researcher, professor in artificial intelligence and computer science at the University of Toronto, said, take any old classification problem where you have a lot of data. It's going to be solved by deep learning, which is his term for AI and machine learning. There's going to be thousands of applications. I think he is right. Pretty much anywhere you have data, you have the opportunity for artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning to take that data and convert it into answers and information for you. There are good ways that this gets used. This is certainly not, I'm going to present some of the Skynet Terminator possibility in a bit, but there are good ways this gets used. Right now, all of us are sitting in front of machines that use AI and probably have machines either in our pocket or sitting on the desk next to us that use AI to do things like classify our pictures, right? All of modern cell phones use artificial intelligence and machine learning to do image classification, so that when I do something like type in the word ocean into my photo manager, it presents me with things that look like this, which is pictures of oceans. It doesn't do that because a cataloger, right, made a decision about, oh, that looks like an ocean. It does that because the machine is trained to look for things that appear as if they are oceans by a very complicated neural engine and or machine learning system that has been trained on a corpus of known images of oceans. And so That is a fantastic, fascinating use, and it gets used in a lot of really interesting ways in the modern world. Modern image analysis and AI is used very, very heavily in things like medical diagnoses. And again, Jeffrey Hinton, one of my favorite AI researchers, said, if you work as a radiologist, you're like Wile E. Coyote in the cartoon. You're already over the edge of the cliff, haven't looked down. There's no ground underneath. It's just completely obvious that in 5 years, deep learning is going to do better than radiologists. As a matter of fact, it didn't take 5 years, it didn't take 10 years. Basically, in the modern world, we have AI systems that are better than humans at diagnosing not only medical imagery for things like cancer, obviously, but also in just general medical diagnoses, telling whether or not someone has a particular disease based on symptomology is something that now machines are like legitimately measurably better at than humans. So these are huge and wonderful sort of impacts that AI might have. It isn't just things like medical or your phone. It is our world, like the world of libraries and information are directly being impacted by this as well. You have companies, Ripcord Digitization is one of these. There's a handful out there if you wanted to go look them up, that are currently focusing on things like corporate libraries and kind of trying to take those over. But it's probably not too far away before they start entering the world of things like academic libraries, where this is a company, and what they do, they literally walk into a corporation, take all of the paper, digitize it in big sheet fed scanners, OCR it, an AI backend engine analyzes all of the language and builds a search tool through machine learning that allows people to then find indexes and finds the information that was digitized. No humans in that at all. Like, this is all being done by basically robots and AI. No human catalogers, none of that. So this is happening. This has been happening for several years. This is not an uncommon sort of thing. It's going to continue to happen, and it will expand into sort of the more direct library world, I think, very shortly. You also have the development of new and really super interesting tools that use machine learning to find things and to index things in ways that are not sort of the traditional library cataloging subject heading mechanism method, right? You have things like Hamlet, which is a tool that was built by a librarian and computer developer named Andromeda Yelton, who took the electronic theses and dissertations from MIT and built a machine learning system that allows you to do discovery against that corpus in a number of really, really interesting ways that are not sort of available to the traditional library catalog or traditional library organization. So if you haven't seen this or haven't looked at this, I highly recommend it. It gives you an idea of the power of machine learning in trying to do findability and discoverability of information. And of course, it's not just good stuff. It's also really scary and difficult, problematic, bad stuff. AI is entirely dependent upon the data that you feed it. If you have a machine learning system, the outcomes of that machine learning system are dependent upon the training data that was used in order to sort of weight that system appropriately. And that data can be very bad. And if you have bad data, if the data is being used in sort of an improper way, then you can introduce bias into the systems that could be unconscious bias, could be bias that isn't noticed, and yet has an effect, a real world effect on people that that we would prefer to avoid. Something like the justice system here in the US. I don't know if you know this, but in many parts of the US, the court system uses an AI-based tool, a machine learning-based tool, in order to determine initial sentencing guidelines. So they literally have a black box tool that they feed sort of the crime into, and it gives them recommendations for sentencing. Of course, this tool is fed the data of previous sentencing in order to do its kind of current outcomes. And we should know, if you don't know, that the history of criminality in the US is incredibly racially biased. And so the data that has fed this machine that we are now relying on is incredibly racially unfair. And so this is an example of the sort of way that AI can be detrimental moving forward in the world. We can apply that same sort of thought to a lot of things. Another sort of worrisome aspect of AI is the use of machine learning and AI in misinformation, disinformation campaigns. I'm not up on the current curricula at SILS, but I imagine that occasionally you might talk about misinformation and disinformation because it is a big part of our modern information ecosystem. There are a number of ways that AI gets used in this sense, from sort of automated bots that flood information channels with disinformation or with information that is particularly tinged in a direction that the people driving it want it to go. There are sort of other things that now are possible that weren't possible even 5 years ago with AI and machine learning. So here's one example. So AI and machine learning systems are now good enough that they can create human faces entirely from nothing. So they can kind of create what appear to be humans, even though they aren't real people. This is used in sort of astroturfing and things online. The two pictures that you're seeing now, right? So one of these is an artificially created human. That is, it was drawn by a machine, and there's no actual real person attached to it. The other one is a real person. So anybody, I'm gonna, in the chat, you want to guess left or right, which one's real? I'll give you a second to do that. Which one of these is a real person? All right, I don't even have to look because you're all wrong. Neither of them are real. These are both fake people. Neither of these are people. These are entirely generated by machines. So are all of these people. These are not real. These are not people. These are graphics that are created by a machine. When I started talking about misinformation and disinformation again 5-6 years ago, it took high-end computers, and it took sort of, you had to have some specialized software and rendering engines underneath, and it took some horsepower to do this sort of work. Well, now it's just a website. So if you go to thispersondoesnotexist.com, you can literally create fake people at will to use in ads or to use in, whatever. So this is becoming more and more common. The other technology that I wanted to talk about very quickly, and I'm going to return to AI a little bit later when we talk about some more of the problems, but the other technology that I wanted to bring up was extended reality. So AR, VR, augmented reality, or virtual reality. And the main reason that I wanted to sort of mention this is that what we tend to think about, if I say augmented reality or virtual reality, right now, the way that people interact with this world is through these sorts of head-mounted, right? You have this thing on your face. You have a computer that you wear on your head. And you can think like Google Glasses, if any of you remember that debacle, or this is the Microsoft HoloLens that's visible here. There are Magic Leap. Apple is rumored to be coming out with their own version of sort of AR glasses shortly, supposedly within the next year or so. But these are all sorts of visible things that are on your face, right? And the whole sort of purpose of AR, or of extended reality, if you want to sort of take it all together, is that it shows you, information about the world or in the world that isn't actually in the world, right? It shows you animals on your desk, or it shows you mechanical objects that you want to compare with other, that you want to, in engineering, you want to use with other people, or it shows you sort of metadata about the world, right? It's the sort of classic sci-fi version of it is you have your glasses on and you look at someone and it tells you who they are and, how you know them or who they're related to, in little bubbles above their head. So that's sort of, information about the world digitally projected upon the real world. And that is the sort of, again, the beneficial use, the sort of way that we think about this technology being useful to us. That's not the part I'm scared of. The part I'm scared of is this. And so this is a quote from a game designer, actually. Sometime in 93 or 94, I read Snow Crash, which, if you have not read, you should read. It is a novel by an author named Neil Stephenson. And for the first time, I thought something like the metaverse might be possible in my lifetime. We're on the cusp of what I think is not the next big platform, but rather the final platform, the platform to end all platforms. So what Mike is talking about, this is Mike Abrish, he's a game designer, a game developer, and what he's talking about here, and what I kind of am worried in this with this technology is, it isn't that we're going to get these happy little informational bubbles about people, by wearing our kind of fancy glasses. It's that the history of technology is from room-sized computers to desktop computers to laptop computers to computers that you in your pocket to computers that you wear on your wrist to probably computers that we wear all the time everywhere, right? And this is again driven by exponential growth and driven by technology. Over time, we can sort of see the endpoint of this being things like, contact lenses, where you have displays directly on your eye that overlay the real world with information. And this is a sample of this. This is an 8x8 grid of LEDs that sort of sets on top of your eyeballs, so 64 pixels there. 64 becomes 128, and 128 becomes 256, and 250, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually, we have HD sort of on our eye. And again, this is not like wacky town future stuff. This is happening. This is being developed. This is a story from January of this year, which feels like 40 years ago, but really is not. Invisible computing startup unveils smart contact lens. So this is a company, a California startup named Mojo Vision. There's a ton of these. There's a bunch of people working on this technology where you have electronics embedded in things that are on your eyeballs. So why do I care about that? So I care about AI because it enables, it can more readily enable us to be unable to distinguish between what is real and what is not real, right? So truth and fiction is one of the reasons that I'm most worried about AI. Why am I worried about augmented reality? It's the same reason that when you have the ability to have a thing on your eyeball that rewrites what you see in front of you, if you think that we're having problems in our modern world with people disagreeing about facts in the world, imagine if we were able to be, imagine if we were in a world where you could literally be standing next to each other and seeing different things, right? Just a completely rewrites the information landscape. It completely rewrites the way we understand like agreement about reality. And That is my biggest worry for the information world, is this barrier between sort of reality-based truth and other sorts of beliefs. So these are the two technologies that worry me the most on that front, and I think will be the most challenging over the next decade or so when it comes to dealing with information. So in the next 5 minutes or so, I'm going to whip through some other problems that I wanted to sort of put in front of you. Since you all are students at SILS, there's I don't want to say it's up to you to solve these problems necessarily, but it's certainly the deal that you are going to run into some of these problems when you enter into the world of libraries or the information sort of larger information ecosystem. Some of these are specifically library focused though. One of the biggest problems with libraries, quite frankly, is that libraries, like much of America, have a racism problem. Historically, libraries are incredibly white. As a matter of fact, the last census, librarians in libraries, this doesn't take into account the census, the numbers that ALA uses breaks out sort of credentialed librarians as a separate unit from like library staff. That may be neither here nor there. These numbers are for librarians. Librarians are 82% white, 5% Black, and 3% Latinx. This is fairly different than the actual demographics of the US, and it can be very, very, very different than the actual communities that the libraries live in. And so that is a problem, not just from a representational point of view. Representation is a problem, but it's also a problem informationally, because choices are being made based on in local libraries based on, well, frankly, racist demographics. Libraries also have a sexism problem. Libraries are 83% librarians as a profession. It's an 83% female profession. Only 57% of library directors in academia are female, and only 65% of public library directors are female. So we also in libraries have a sexism problem, which needs to be more directly addressed than it has been over the last few decades. We have a number of political problems. If you work in a library, especially in much of America, your funding is from your immediate local area, your local government. This is a positive and a negative in a lot of ways. But one of the challenges is that libraries and librarians are not usually trained in politics. That is, we're not sort of, at least when I was at SILS, we did not have political science classes, nor did we have classes that were revolved around sort of the understanding of community budgeting or how to deal with a mayor. And that ends up being at a leadership level a lot of what especially public libraries, but even academic libraries work with. There are places in the library ecosystem who do specialize in this. If you aren't familiar with this group, I wanted to point them out specifically. Everylibrary.org, this is a political action committee effectively for libraries that focuses on building voter support throughout the country for libraries. So if a library has a bond issue that's going out in order to do some improvements, right, on buildings or something, this group, Every Library, will and advise them politically on how to ensure that that bond gets passed. And so that sort of work is not something that library schools often focus on, but it is an ever increasing aspect of importance to libraries. Another challenge for libraries in the modern era, as well as I think moving forward. There's a fairly strong fracture in theory in the library world as to whether free speech means everyone gets to talk, or whether that means you have to be protective of disenfranchised voices in ways that enable them to be heard. And so, if you aren't familiar with this problem in libraries, with this sort of philosophical debate, I would advise you to take a look, because if you move out into the library world, it will probably come up, and I think you should have an opinion on it. I think you should probably read the couple of things that I have here. I would suggest that, at least. Karl Popper is a philosopher who wrote a huge amount of things. He's most famous probably for the philosophy of science stuff that he wrote. But Open Society and Its Enemies is a good place to start for library and upcoming librarians. So that is a challenge. We have an ongoing challenge in libraries, sort of writ large, that libraries are, much like education in the US, often expected to operate under conditions of austerity. That is the classic do more with less problem in libraries. We will have our funding, libraries often have their funding reduced, and yet are expected to continue developing services and delivering the services that they were, regardless of the amount of money that they are given. And many of the times people who move into libraries, myself included, are strongly believe that, you know, the things we do are important, and so we should find a way to do them regardless. Arguing for the appropriate money to do the work that libraries need to do is a thing that people need to be aware of in libraries and need to be able to do more of. I worry about the sort of classic library ethics as the austerity sort of libraries, as our funding is reduced over time. A lot of the functionality that libraries used to do internally are now done externally by vendors, right? So everything from sort of cataloging, which is now in public libraries, especially small public libraries, mostly done by vendors. They just get things pre-cataloged. A lot of the sort of that externalizing of what was previously internal library operations have the opportunity to remove our ethical decisions about how we would like things to be presented. It takes it out of the hands of librarians and it gives it to external operators, right? It gives it to vendors, or it gives it to companies, rather than letting us make our decisions. And I worry about that as an erosion of the sort of classical ethical decision-making in libraries, which I think is pretty important. I worry that a lot of our patrons are operating inside of incredibly small filter bubbles when it comes to their information, and that libraries have not sufficiently worked to sort out how they can help expand those bubbles. We have a challenge here in the modern era about over-filtering of the information that's coming to us, so that we just get, it's the classic Facebook problem of reinforcement cycles of belief, where you just, you know, because one time you decided to click on an ad and now that's the only thing you ever get ads for. It's like that, except for news. And that's a problem in a lot of ways as far as information flows and the way that we make sure that our communities are educated. And as a part of the sort of externalizing of some of the work that libraries have traditionally done internally, I worry about the incentives of the vendors that we pay to do the work, because as nonprofit entities and or social kind of community good, social good organizations, libraries have different incentives than for-profit corporations do. And I worry that the distinction between those two incentives often harms us in ways that might be invisible until the harm is already done. And finally, before we get to some questions, I just want to say that, like, I really think libraries are important. I can't emphasize how deeply I feel that libraries are a core functional aspect of a democratic society and a educated community. And so I think that the work that libraries do is foundational to the growth of our, of our country, of the world, etc. And so I hope that as all of you here go out into these worlds, you make it a better place, because it's real important. And so this is me. This is all of my kind of contact information. Feel free to reach out if I can ever be of any service at all. And with that, I would love to take a few questions.
Thank you, Jason. I don't see any questions in chat. Audience members, you do have the opportunity to unmute yourself if you want, and you can talk directly. But if you are more comfortable using chat, I'm happy to play the MC. Jason, I had a few questions for you to get started in case. I know on this audience we have current students and recent graduates, and cool. A couple questions that I had. One, how do you recommend new professionals in the field continue to learn about either new technology or what, how these things are impacting libraries when they're outside of the classroom? I think sometimes when they're in school, they're getting, syllabi and suggested readings and all the time. So what are some of your best practices for staying up on the field?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the classic answer is professional organizations. So the answer is something like ALA or PLA, SLA, one of the sort of large library organizations. The truth of the matter is that at this point, those are sort of less impactful than a well-curated social media feed, probably. At least that's been my experience. And so the library world is fairly Twitter heavy. There are lots of important and sort of I don't want to say foundational, but certainly there are lots of important discussions that start on Twitter for the library world. Things like the recent Library Journal recently awarded the Seattle Public Library Library of the Year, right, for 2020. There were a number of librarians that were really unhappy about this, myself included. I'll be completely upfront. And a fairly large amount of them created some documentation for why there were protests, et cetera, that as a part of the sort of public, sort of the library conversation really was triggered and followed through on Twitter to begin with. And so something like a well-curated library list is on Twitter is probably the best quick place to get news. For broader impact, if you really do want to sort of put your shoulder to the world and move things, sometimes it is helpful to be, attached to ALA or have some larger organization that you can be a part of and you can help move along. But if you're just looking for sort of inputs, my suggestion would be, I keep using the word well curated because, well, social media is a cesspool, but be careful and watch who you're following, and I think you'll be good.
Thank you. Another question I had, a lot of the things to watch out for in the future of libraries are potentially things that leadership will have more input into how they're addressed. Do you have any recommendation for new professionals that may not be necessarily decision makers in their organization of how to make sure that they're not losing focus on these big issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, uh, the classic answer is still maybe the best one, and that is that collective action tends to change decision makers' minds. So, if you are in situations where you disagree, or you believe that something isn't happening fast enough, finding like-minded people and banding together in order to make change is, I mean, that's a time-tested and well-proven mechanism for for making change in the world in general.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
and that can start locally. That can also start more broadly, through networks of friends across the U.S. I will say, as a toolkit, like if you want to keep your tools sharp and at the ready, I am still in touch with and still rely on some of my friends from SILS, 15 years later. Some of them have, and I think I said this in the commencement address that I gave earlier this year, but they uh, people that I know from SILS are now the ones in power positions in a lot of libraries. And so being able to poke them and say, hey, how would you do this? Do you have any advice? What would you recommend? Who should I talk to? Those sorts of things. Those are all incredibly valuable. So keeping in touch with the people that you know now will be more important over time. Libraries are really big. There's, I don't know, 180,000 librarians in the country or something. There's a lot of us. But it turns out it's actually really small. The networks are, the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon is really, really true in the library world. And so being able to ask people for recommendations is a big part of what you'll find.
That might be part of your answer to my next question, but um, uh, uh, specifically in this economic swirling of a pandemic season, for these students that are either class of 2020, December 2019, or even going forward, one of the things I've been suggesting is it's a great time to build your network if there's not as many actual postings being listed. And some students are a little uncomfortable necessarily bothering people who probably have a lot on their plate at this time. And so
Yeah.
what would you recommend in terms of recent graduates in terms of their job search during this pandemic?
Yeah. Never be afraid to bug somebody. I mean, the very worst thing that can happen is that they ignore you, right? I mean, that's like the worst. And the best is they have a job upcoming and they think, oh, well, you're interested. Let me show you that position before here's the position description before we make it public. What do you think?
Mm-hmm.
Jobs in libraries, much like the rest of the world, often come down to hearing about it before other people do. And you do that through networks. There are definitely many examples I could give of people giving others a heads up about a job that isn't listed yet, or that will be coming, or that they know someone is leaving and they'll be replacing, and all of that sort of stuff happens way before those become public, way before they hit job lists, way before they show up on university web pages. And so don't be afraid to ask people like if you know someone in a library, if you have a friend, if you met someone at a conference, if you whatever, don't be afraid to drop them an email and say, hey, I'm a new graduate. I think I would love to work in this area. If you hear of anything, just let me know.
Thank you. I'm going to stop for a minute and see if anybody has any additional questions.
Nothing. Come on, people.
Do you have any recommendations for keeping positive with so much? I mean, like, you have the one concept of it's one of the best occupations in the world to want to work in libraries because you're doing so much for society, and yet all of these major things are stacked up against us. So how do you keep positive in your view?
Yeah, I mean, a large part of it is just that what I said near the end of the little talk there was I really do think that libraries, much like public education or a couple of other things, are it's just a fundamental aspect of a well-functioning society, and I don't think we need to be martyrs because of that, but I do think that we need to recognize the value in the work we do and make sure that others recognize the value in the work we do. Making sure that our community understands the degree to which investment in libraries and librarians is an investment in the community and in the kind of furthering of the people in the community, educationally, vocationally, economically, right? Like all of these things that libraries do for our communities are, are often not trumpeted enough. Like, it's very easy to get feel-good stories about children's reading hours, right? Like, it's really easy for communities to be like, I love the children's librarian, and the fact that they read to my 4-year-old is awesome. Well, yes, that's completely true, and that is a very valuable aspect of libraries. But we also act as, economic drivers and education for people who don't have opportunities in higher ed, and like all of these other things that are valuable and important for communities. And so, I think that recognizing that value and sort of understanding that the skills we have in that arena are important, that's one of the things that keeps me going. It is a real weird time though, folks. I am good luck.
We did have one comment in the chat about if the time is stretching out between graduation and finding employment, do you have recommendations for how employers would see you in the best possible light of how you might be spending that time?
That's a good question. I mean, so from the perspective of being like on a hiring committee at a library, it's a little different between academic and public, depending upon your focus there. So if you were interested in academic libraries, continuing to be sort of active in some aspect of I don't want to say research because that sounds so formal, but certainly being a part of the conversation in libraries, continuing to attend virtual online opportunities like this one, right? Like continuing to do that sort of thing, that's important, and that'll be taken into certainly hiring committees. All the hiring committees I've been a part of would look very favorably on that, since it shows that you are actively interested in making sure that you're up to date and that you're keeping up with things. Public libraries are going to be interested in your sort of connection to your community in a lot of ways. So if you are interested in being, kind of moving into the public library sphere, I mean, it sounds silly, but volunteer work and things like that really do go a long way, because public library work is often about that community connection. So showing that one of the things you value personally, right, is the making your community better, is a thing that will look good to library directors, public library directors. So it's a couple of things.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. Jason, I want to thank you again for taking on this opportunity. We really appreciate hearing more from you and expanding on these things, and it's given us a lot to think about. I want to thank the audience members for being here today, and to let them know that later this week there'll be an evaluation form that we'll send out, not only to get feedback on this event, but also to think about topics for future events, because we've now done this a couple times and we think we're going to continue. And so we want to hear from people about what topics they're interested in and what wonderful alums we can bring in to talk about those different topics. So thank you again, and
if
have a great day.
If I can be of any service to anybody, you can know how to get in touch with me. So just let me know.
Thank you, Jason.